Uncle Si.
So, I mean, I think you get sort of the most information on him at the very end in his sort of like last conversation with the cop when he like sort of goes into this whole thing about like kids being molested and like being forced to do things they don't want to do, which we have no evidence of the kid in question that ever being a situation. He sort of sums it up by saying, and this guy was a bad father, but clearly he's talking about more than just this one father. He probably, his father, I'm guessing, had some major issues. I'm guessing probably father rather than mother, since he like tries to find, he like pretends this picture was his mom, so he clearly has maybe some possible fondness there, or maybe the mom was just absent and he wants to like fill a place that she could have been in. But yeah, I think molestation definitely father.
So I think one major teaching point here is the narrative itself. Forgetting the content, but the process of the narrative called 1 Hour Photo. And that is, we're focused on this individual character, Sai, for not only the 90 plus minutes that we view the movie, that we watch the movie, but certainly over the course of several days, if not weeks, of what's transpiring in this individual's life. And then at the very end of the film, we are given a significant amount of information that really changes the narrative. It really gives us an understanding of the ideology of behavior that we viewed. And it certainly should shape our provisional diagnosis, our critical thinking of what was going on. So, irrespective of the actual detail for now, we have to appreciate that. So, clinical Pearl, this is not going to come up on a shelf exam, but clinical Pearl, do not think that you know the full story when you're talking to a person that you're interviewing, new patient eval, for 60 minutes. Right? Just you can't possibly think that way. The clinician has to have a significant level of humility that you don't know all the details. And I think 1 Hour Photo serves to remind us of that. So that's first and foremost.
Especially like snapshots specifically. We're only ever seeing these snapshots.
Yep. And what a great metaphor.
Yeah.
Right? Right? Well, all we know is a snapshot. And boy, be very careful. Be very careful. By the way, I'll even kind of take this to another layer. There's a snapshot in psychiatry that is a projective test called the Thematic Apperception Test, TAT. Anybody know what the TAT is? The TAT is a projective test in which an individual during psychiatric evaluation is shown a picture that is made to be ambiguous. And they are asked, what is happening in this scene? What is happening in this photo?
It's basically like Rorschach.
Exactly right. Where the Rorschach test is an ink blot, the TAT is a photo. It's a picture. But it's the same exact thing.
There's like some kid hiding kind of like behind a tree, and all of that. Like, which one do you identify with, kind of thing?
No closed-ended questions. What's happening? Open-ended. And now the individual's personality is projected onto that. In such a case, Uncle Si might say that child behind the tree is hiding from his father who wants to molest him. The clinician would certainly take that content and have an understanding of what might be going on in that individual's subconscious. If they projected that impulse from the id onto this ambiguous stimulus called the TAT. Ink blot's the same exact thing, different test, different ink.
Well, I think it's kind of interesting, like, because that sort of happened with him, of like sort of his imagining of where he would fit into the picture that would take place, and especially at the end when they show the picture of like him and that family, he imagines himself as being an uncle. I think imagining himself as a father would be too intimidating given his own father.
Not only that, but he also has this image in his head that the photos are depicting a perfect family, and it's not really true. And we see like it's tied to today's social media as well. I was thinking throughout the movie that maybe we're scrolling through Instagram and stuff, and we think that those pictures are the reality of their lives, but that's not quite the case, as he comes to find out and becomes very frustrated with it when he finds out that perfect family is really not very perfect in real life.
I think that's fair.
Yeah.
I think that's fair. The other part of it too is that when you are presented with information and when you are making a provisional diagnosis, and that's going to be part of your history taking. I mean, active thinking and active case formulation during the patient interview. That's what healthcare is. That's what providing mental health care means. When you pump the brakes and you acknowledge that you are not going to have the full story in 60 or even 90 minutes, that is the psychiatric evaluation, and new information then does become available, reinforcing that a week later, a month later, do not pat yourself on the back too quickly. Because even though the new information certainly will shape your provisional diagnosis, it's still not the full story. And you may never know the full story. So even though we think that there's something going on with molestation that is disclosed in the last 10 minutes or so of this movie, I would actually think that there's still much, much more below the surface, even though your mind can't go there. But what could be worse than molestation? There is worse. We're going to discuss that at 12:30 pertaining to another film. But the idea that you discovered it and therefore your search should end as a clinician, not so fast.
So I have a question. So I agree. Like, I thought this movie was very ahead of its time, given when it came out. Social media wasn't what it is today. In kind of like delving into that thing where we're always looking at other people, thinking that like they've got it all. And I was wondering, so in the DSM we don't really have something about like social media, but I know it's sort of becoming much more common for people to really have a lot of like anxiety that's tied in with participating in social media. And I was wondering if you thought there was any potential change in DSM regarding
Absolutely. No, absolutely. We know for a fact, especially with regard to child adolescent data, that people not only are on social media, but their self-worth is significantly influenced by social media, and specifically what we're discussing, and that is, in a snapshot, it looks like a post paints the perfect picture. That means that I am not perfect because I haven't done that, and I wasn't able to take a selfie there, or I did not capture that, or that is not part of my personal experience. Therefore, I must be imperfect. We see this all the time, absolutely.
Nothing also in CBT, there is one that's a cognitive distortion, I think, the thought of, and I think they call it unjust comparison, because when you see those photos, you start comparing yourself to them, and you start thinking, why do I not look like this, or why am I not achieving those things? But at the end of the day, it's not it's a dysfunctional thought, because you can really not compare yourself to other people.
I was just curious, kind of like, what sort of what it would maybe fall under if you had to like guess. Like, there's like, you can think of like body dysmorphia, like almost like a life dysmorphia in a way, or like anxiety or depression.
I think it's an expansion of the concept of self-image, right?
That plays into so many things.
Right.
Yeah.
Self-image is biopsychosocial. I think our mind instantly goes to the bio part of that, self-image eating disorders with regard to how I look, but self-image is much more than that. And I would start there. By the way, when it comes to the bio part of that, we also know that different posts on different social media platforms allow for filters too. So what you're seeing isn't true either, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because I still don't look like that, even if that's a distorted view of what I'm looking at. And distorted in a good way, too good a way. And then the other part of this too is the other end as well, that once the individual posts, if they don't get 1,000 likes in the first hour, there might be decompensation from their end as well, because they are not being validated, right? That we find that very problematic too. Yes, we've had suicide attempts because of a different threshold or a particular threshold of likes not being reached within 1 hour, 1 day, whatever. We've had those presented to acute psychiatric services, right? So it's definitely problematic. We're behind the curve in terms of figuring out what's going on and how best to address it again from a preemptive role, from a primary prevention role. We're definitely in a tertiary care model now, Once they act on these urges, whether you're the one posting, whether you're the one who is seeing the post, then psychiatry is in place. Once the suicide attempt occurs, once the individual presents with depression, etc. But again, in those that present, circling back to this film, be careful. The person who comes in and tells you, man, I feel like crap. I have no motivation, doc. I'm sad all the time. And I got these fleeting ideas that I could end it all. I have no energy. I can't sleep. Food doesn't taste right to me. Doc, nothing's working right for me. That's depression. Okay? Not all depression is created equal. Etiology, much more complex. And just pump the brakes. You're not going to figure it all out in meeting a person for the first time. You're just not. Right? And when you do discover something, be careful not to pat yourself on the back too quickly, right? Because there's much more to the story that you still don't know, and that's critical. It's critical to appreciate.
I have a quick question. In terms of what we were discussing before with the social media and now speaking of suicidality based on like that threshold of likes and everything like that, have you noticed if there's a specific age range that's associated with it? Is it seen most likely in younger adults or teens rather than, or is it?
It's pervasive, definitely pervasive, definitely younger teens. And you see that definite curve. For those who are of a generation that are not even part of social media, we're not seeing this.
Right.
I mean, if you ask my grandmother with regard to how many likes did she get, and is that causing her any clinically significant distress or impairment, she's going to look at me and say, I'm not going to do the accent. She's going to say, what are you talking about?
I guess I'm at more, once you grow up in this society, as you grow up and get older, does that still remain with you as an...
We have to assume yes.
Yeah.
I don't think we have all the data in just yet,
Okay.
but I'm going to suspect yes. There might be some burnout. I suspect there will be, but I think we should think this through as it being persisting into the adult. Just because you get older doesn't mean you get more mature, right? That the insight may not be there in terms of what it really means, especially if you grew up with this. Again, maturity here, I'm using as a crude term for insight. Back to Uncle Si.
Oh, I just have sort of related.
Or not.
Sorry, this is quick. I was just wondering, have they found that like earlier introduction of like cell phones and social media? Because like, I mean, even for me, like I feel like I got a cell phone probably later than some kids now, or like Facebook and Instagram. Has that been shown to be correlated with more depression? As far as maybe like, I don't know, if they'd be advising parents like not to let kids have access to that stuff.
Right. So I think with full disclosure that there really are not wonderful placebo-controlled trials for this.
Yeah.
We're talking about observational data. The answer is yes. And it's a little tricky here. Is it that you weren't necessarily given a cell phone earlier, or was it more of the related issue of your being able to look face to face into another human being and connect? Because the two are different, although they're obviously very closely related and inverse, right?
Yeah, I didn't have the internet on my cell phone until I was like 18. So yeah, it is a bigger, like now they have it at like 11.
And again, I suspect that if we had a control group that offered that as an inclusion criteria, is it the product of that independent variable that leads to stated outcomes, or is it the related criteria of you being able to connect to another human face to face and have that kind of personal contact? Is that protective versus the use of the cell phone, especially early, being disruptive? And I don't know if we've ever really teased that out. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Because hypothetically, one doesn't necessarily come at the exclusion of the other. If somebody says, yeah, I use my cell phone 10 hours a day, and I'm on social media platforms 10 hours a day, they may actually still have face-to-face contact with human beings with regard to extracurricular activities, etc., above average in terms of compared to their age-matched peers. So one doesn't necessarily come at the exclusion of the other, although of course it usually does.
Oh, I was going back to Cy, I think there was, I was curious about like reaction formation in him. His life is so organized and put together, like he's so clean cut. Like when he comments in his imagination, when he goes into the kid's room and he says, oh, it's a bit of a mess, I bet your mom has told you about this. makes you wonder maybe furthering what his home life was like, maybe not just the abuse, but also like other home issues as well.
Absolutely.
That made me think that maybe when we got to the end of the movie, it made me think that what if that scene in the hotel didn't actually happen? It could have maybe happened in his head, just like when he invaded the home. So it made me think, and like also piggybacking on your idea about the cleanliness. It's very interesting because his house is all very organized, and it's the colors are very neutral. Everything is neutral in his life. The only color that he has is from the family on the photo wall, and when he's at work with the blue vest. So he kind of shows us that's the only thing that he's enjoying in his life. It's that family and his work. And then at the end of the movie, when he loses both, I think that's when he has a major mental breakdown.
So a couple of aspects to discuss here. With regard to what you just stated, that is very consistent with the schizoid personality. All right, so cold and distant with regard to interpersonal relationships, and really the most gainful relationships are through photos, right? And it may not be only his family. And he sees thousands of photos, and he's part of a lot of people's personal lives, even if they don't know it. Right? So that's number one. And we could discuss this with regard to the schizoid personality, and therefore the schizoid personality disorder, to the extent that it's clinically significant. The other issue here with regard to Psy is the idea of reaction formation. And I think that we need to just go off on a bit of a tangent here and really discuss the role, in as much as it is part of OCPD. So now we have two personality disorders, one cluster A, OCPD, cluster C. So the question often comes up, and you're going to see this in some context on tests, the difference between OCPD and the related condition of obsessive compulsive disorder. Okay. I do not want to hear you tell me one is egosyntonic and one is egodystonic. I don't care what your board review books say. That's true, but boy, are you missing a bigger picture here. If you think that the distinguishing characteristic is egosyntonic versus egodystonic, that's like answering the question, what's the difference between this medical student and the Empire State Building? For you to say, well, one is real tall and the other one is of average height, you're not wrong, but I think you're missing a bigger picture, right? Same exact thing. What you need to know is that both have a common etiology, which is why we name them similarly. The common etiology is called isolation of affect. It's a defense mechanism. Okay? The maladaptive context of which may lead to OCPD and or OCD. With other stuff too, but those are the two that often commonly come. So before we even go further in this conversation, I would suggest that Psy is utilizing a defense called isolation of affect, and has been doing so ever since his first trauma. So let's first talk about isolation of affect, generally speaking, and then let's see if we can apply it to the prequel of 1 Hour Photo and what happened to Psy when he was young. So generally speaking, what is isolation of affect?
Isolate your emotion away from what happened, so you talk about it without any kind of...
Exactly right. Okay, so let's keep in the here and now. I need a volunteer who's willing to share something. Let's keep it fun, kind of. Sports. Anybody here a sports fan? A real fanatic? You guys all. Really? Not one sports fan.
I like sports, I would call myself a fanatic.
Can you give me a team?
Giants.
Giants. You consider yourself a Giants fan?
Yeah.
Have you ever been to a Giants game?
Yeah.
Good enough. Okay. Let's say, I'm not going to even pick one out, but let's say that after a very tough loss, maybe even a loss that eliminated you from the playoffs, you go into school the next day, right? I mean, it's happened before, right? And let's say a peer, another student, another medical student at Robert Wood, approached you and you knew it was not a Giant fan, maybe the despicable Dallas Cowboy fan, and present to you and say, hey, by the way, did you catch yesterday's game? Okay? There's a couple things you can do. Now, it's a peer. You can tell them to take a little bit of a walk, right? But let's say an attending did it. right? And you're in this attending clerkship, so you're probably not gonna go tell them to get lost. And you're gonna probably have to stay in the here and now and engage in a conversation, okay? In such situations, you can employ isolation of affect. You could have the idea of that elimination game, come to conscious awareness so that now you can discuss it, but separate the affect from it and keep that affect in the subconscious so that you are not emotionally invested in the topic, right? The conversation ends, the attending walks away, and so do you, right? Isolation of affect. Separating the idea from the affect, isolating that affect in the subconscious so as not to become emotionally invested in a topic that you don't want any part of this day. Right? So that's isolation of affect. What may have happened, or can you give me now the scenario, the fictional scenario, for Cy when he was young? You're making this up. No, we don't know this.
Maybe when his father, if we go with the ending, that his father was taking inappropriate pictures of him, maybe he had some isolation of affect there, and this is coming up later on in his life as his love for pictures, but you can see that he has almost this childlike love for pictures in the sense that he likes the pictures to be about the little things that people don't really care about.
Stay on your idea with regard to as a child.
Mm-hmm.
Give me this scenario where he's demonstrating isolation of affect.
Then maybe afterwards he can pick up the camera and start taking pictures of those things for himself.
He's 5. He has on a camera.
I was gonna say maybe he to not deal with his trauma from childhood, he used pictures to kind of cope, kind of put himself, I don't know if that's really isolation of affect, but he kind of suppresses what's actually going on in his life and kind of lives through the pictures.
Good. Anybody else? Well, again, given the scenario that I gave you, Giant Fan, what likely happened to Cy that resulted in his employing isolation of affect?
I mean, I think there would have been some confrontation about the bad pictures that his dad would have taken of him. Maybe he did, maybe it wasn't his camera, but I think what she's trying to get is that maybe he saw pictures on the dad's camera, or somebody, or maybe his dad was arrested and he had to confront it at that point.
Who confronted him? And confrontation here is a term we might be harsh, but I get the point. Who confronted him?
I would say police.
Yeah.
Yeah. Given his interactions with
It
his
would
cop.
explain why his family's not in his life too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We don't know
Yeah.
where they are.
His mom may have saw the pictures and said, honey, I need to talk to you about something very serious, all right? And a young Cy engaged in that conversation, but employed isolation of affect because there was some part of him that did not want to become emotionally invested in the conversation of what his dad did to him. Whether it was with his mother, whether it was with a cop, that's what happened. And this worked.
Well, I thought it was also interesting because he talks about his own childhood and how he was picked on and how he was overweight and always sick. And he mentioned hepatitis, which that sort of triggered as soon as he said that. That's not a necessarily common thing for a kid to have. And so, I started to wonder if there maybe were any other STDs that he might have gotten as a child.
Yeah.
So I think in that situation, he might have been confronted with a doctor because he might have gone to receive treatment
Could have been
for
a doctor
an
too.
STD or something.
In any case, police, mother, doctor, isolation of affect was employed for a reason. Right? He wanted to avoid the threat of that impulse coming to conscious awareness. He did not want to relive that experience, and it worked. Okay? If it works, is it going to continue, or is it going to cease to continue?
Cease.
It's,
I think it only worked for a period of time.
it's going to continue. But let's talk about basic behavioral mechanisms.
Okay.
All right? He wants to avoid that adverse feeling of the impulse coming to conscious awareness. And because he's able to avoid that, it works. So his use of this maladaptive defense continues, which means that it's reinforced by the removal of the noxious stimulus, the impulse. That is, it never comes to conscious awareness. This is negative reinforcement. And through negative reinforcement principles, When he is 6, he does it again. When he's 7, he does it again. Basically, anytime anybody brings up something he doesn't want to talk about, he resorts to isolation of affect. Speculative, but that's what I think is going on here.
I thought you meant, like, would it continue to work?
Right.
I would say no. At some point, it wouldn't work anymore.
Absolutely agree with you, dear. Because it becomes a rigid defense. And when defenses become rigid, they do provide a risk factor for future mental illness, including those within the personality disorder spectrum. And one of those is going to be, I almost said PTSD, Freudian slip, obsessive compulsive personality. Now, there's a problem, and that is the defense is not going to keep the affect isolated indefinitely. He'll be doing whatever. And that isolated affect is going to come to conscious awareness just because that's a natural progression of things. You just can't, it just doesn't go away. And when it does come to conscious awareness, closer and closer, he's going to feel that as anxiety. And because he feels that as anxiety, he's going to have to employ another defense because isolation of affect isn't working. What defense he next employs will determine whether he manifests as OCPD versus OCD. If that secondary defense is reaction formation, it's a complete 180 turn of the inner chaos into outward discharge, perfectionism, and control, he's going to be diagnosed as obsessive compulsive personality. If that secondary defense instead is undoing, he's going to engage in a ritualistic act to serve to alleviate that anxiety, hand washing, etc. He will be diagnosed with having obsessive compulsive disorder. That's the anxiety disorder. And if he employs both, he's going to have comorbidity. He's going to have both OCD and OCPD. That's the difference between these two separate conditions. They have a common variable. They have a common etiology. That common etiology is called isolation of affect. The secondary defense will determine which one or both disorder he's diagnosed with. Right. Is there any evidence that he has OCD?
I mean, I don't think so, but I mean, he does like keep the pictures in his house like arranged so very precisely. But otherwise, I'd say probably not really.
Yeah. So I think it's more OCPD as well.
I think it's mostly that.
That's certainly an area of further question.
Like the perfectionism is so obvious when he gets into the fight with the tech about the 0.3 cyan shift and how much that mattered to him. Like he needed it to be so perfect with the calibration of the machine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely OCPD.
Yeah.
All right, anything else about Uncle Si here? I mean, certainly what he does is an infraction on others' personal liberties. So there's a blatant disregard for others' safety and rights. So there's an aspect, if not the cardinal feature, of the antisocial personality. So whether related to or independent from the childhood trauma, I would want to know if there's any evidence of conduct disorder. Because if the answer is no, then we have to be concerned, but it's probably going to be under the supervision of law enforcement with regard to what he's doing and what he did. And clearly, he's in a police station. So at some point, they're probably going to bring in a psychiatrist. And one thing the psychiatrist will have to know is whether there's evidence of conduct prior to the age of 50. And if this is indeed antisocial personality. It may or may not be.
I feel like I would guess no.
I'm
I
gonna
don't think he
speculate.
ever would have done it, like hurt.
Well, here's a question. With all the photos he has, are any of the family dog? I mean, it would be interesting.
In the imagination, he's around the family dog and he's just kind of chilling with it. Like, he doesn't seem to mind the dog. He says something to him.
Maybe not. Would be interesting though if he had an old photo of him and the family dog and what that might mean. Again, it would be a TAT for us. What's going on in that picture? Is he getting ready to harm the dog? Like, what are we thinking?
Yeah.
Right? That would have been interesting. So they blew that one. That would have been very interesting to see.
I don't know, I think they kind of rule it out when he's sort of sitting with the dog and he's just kind of watching TV, hanging out with the dog. He seems happy with it.
And that's his wish fantasy, right? And his wish fantasy doesn't include a knife or anything.
Yeah,
so not likely antisocial personality. What else? Anything else? Think he's psychotic? I mean, if you met with him, do you think that he would talk about this family as his own? Do you think he's lost grip with reality, or his grip with reality?
He does talk about the family as his own when he talks to the waitress.
But the look on his face, it just seems like he's trying to cover it up because he's sort of been semi-caught, and he seems uncomfortable.
I just enjoy to be able to fantasize that he's part of that family, but I didn't get the sense that he truly believed he was part of it,
Yeah.
and that I think he knew that in reality he was not, but it kind of suited him to fantasize that he was a part of it. But I do think he had a grip in reality in the sense that, yeah, I'm not part of it, but I would love to be.
He like maintains really good boundaries with them up until obviously that last scene, but before that, like the family would never know, you know? I mean, his boundaries start to slip definitely more and more, like when he stops by the soccer game. But before that, like the mom would have never been able to guess because he maintains this very professional demeanor. And he always has a very good excuse, like when he happens to see her in the mall, you know, and like the Deepak, you know, he plays it very cool that he had never seen that in her bag, kind of, you know, didn't bring that part up. So.
Yeah, I mean, there's some premeditation here.
Yeah.
Which again is concerning. What's also interesting too is that when that wall is revealed, certainly I think one of the things that we understand, and perhaps not being conscious of it, is that he has not had anybody in his apartment for years. That's how private his life is, and that's how schizoid this character is.
Yeah.
I mean, there's an absolute cutoff from the outside world once he enters that apartment, and it's for as long as he started that wall, which is likely several years. So.
Well, I mean, he has like the pictures in there of her being pregnant, and the kid is what, 12 or something? 9?
9, yeah.
Okay.
Actually, I had a question about that because when I was thinking about this, him being schizoid, I thought that he wanted to be part of the family's life. So he had this desire for social and interpersonal relationships. So I was thinking more in the lines also of avoidant personality disorder, because I think the difference between the two is that avoidant, they want that connection, and the schizoid, they're just happy to be alone.
It's tricky here, because remember, one of the key defense mechanisms for the schizoid personality is fantasy, okay, and maladaptive fantasy at that. So we're talking about something that guides and governs the tea party when someone is 3 or 4, but now that they're 43 or 44 becomes incredibly maladaptive. And to what extent do we actually see his fantasy, the defense mechanism, play out versus us perhaps misinterpreting that as his desire to have close connections, because clearly he has no desire for close connections. Again, nobody's been in his apartment for 9 years at least. What's going on with this family is pure fantasy, right? I mean, he's got this absolute fictional relationship with this family through photos, and that is very schizoid-like. So we'd have to, and for someone to be that socially isolated due to avoidant personality disorder would result in their very likely self-referring to one of us for anxiety or depression. And there's no evidence of that at all. So.
I think his relationship with the other tech really goes to show that as well. Like, I think he is very happy with that relationship, that he can just go to work, they sort of work separately but can communicate well, and like when he leaves, he does kind of want to say something like, I've enjoyed working with you, and that to him is sort of an ideal relationship almost. Like, I don't see you very often, we don't really talk, you know, that makes him happy.
Yep. Remember, individuals with this condition will usually gravitate to solitary jobs that nobody else wants, right? So like the graveyard shift at NORAD, right? Lighthouse keeper. Right? Not that every lighthouse keeper has schizoid personality, it's not the case, because that is an ultra cool job, by the way. But that's the type of job that people with this personality disorder will gravitate to. And it's really interesting that his job becomes the title of this movie. And I think because it's central to understanding who this character is. He really only could connect with people through, at the time, a two-dimensional world, right? These photos.
And I think I viewed his dedication to his job almost as like reaction information, in the sense that there's multiple instances throughout the movie where especially the boss points to the fact that this is not a desirable job. It's not that important, and he gives it all this importance.
Yeah. Point.
I don't know, I kind of also liked that in some way. Like, I feel like our culture can be very dismissive of like labor jobs, and in certain other cultures, they actually do, as a society, kind of try to give more esteem to jobs that like you wouldn't be able to necessarily have a functioning society without. Like in Japan, for instance, like to be somebody who keeps a shop, like a grocery store or something, that's not seen as this sort of like low prestige job. It's just a nice job. Whereas here, and I think maybe COVID has sort of pointed some of this out, of like what is an essential worker and why do we value these things so little? And like for him saying like, photos are essential. It is the thing that people wish to take out of a burning house. And maybe, we shouldn't kind of look down on these jobs as much as we do.
Good point. Good point. So one of the jobs too, and again, this could enter into your conversation as well, that I think points to this diagnosis of schizoid is the short story by, I think it's Melville, right? Bartleby, the Scrivener. Anybody here familiar with that tale? So Bartleby happens to work at a dead letter office. Anybody know what a dead letter office is? When a letter gets returned to sender, but the return address is wrong, where does it go? Well, it goes to this office for filing. And all you do, from whether it's 9 to 5, whether it's between midnight and 6, I don't know the shift work, is file these letters. That's it. Right? So it's not a job that a lot of people really look forward to doing. But Bartleby loves it because it allows him to not connect with other people. And that's his wish. Right? So that's Melville. And again, I think Bartleby, the character, is another fictional case account of the schizoid personality. I think personally, the first 48 hours might be ultra cool, depending on when you work, because all the Dear Santa letters usually go there. Because they're not going to go to the North Pole, spoiler alert. And sometimes people don't put their return address correctly and they end up at the dead letter office. So seeing all those come in late December, maybe even early January, might be kind of cool. Like, oh goodness, look what's going on here. But after a while, it's probably going to run its course. Any final thoughts on our character today?
I thought not outside, but the little boy, he was certainly much more perceptive than you would expect for somebody his age. And I was kind of curious, like your thoughts on that.
Give me a mature kid.
Yeah.
If maladaptive, and if he comes to clinical attention for anxiety, for example, that age inappropriate perceptive nature, if you want to call it that, would be certainly something I'd investigate and ask myself the question why. But you've heard me say this dozens of times, it's normal until proven otherwise.
Yeah.
And one trait that might give it a little bit of an atypical presentation would be co-occurring anxiety. Because in that context,
Distress.
Huh?
It seemed to cause him distress.
I mean, that means that his mom may take him to see a pediatrician, if not a child adolescent psychiatrist, who would ask about abuse.
Well, and I was also thinking how he's seeming to overhear a lot of conversations that are inappropriate for him to be overhearing between the mom and the dad. And that could be adding to it.
Yeah, it definitely could be.
I just wanted to backtrack actually, because I was thinking about what Gabby said about avoidant versus schizoid, and you said like fantasy is a piece of schizoid. So how do you, like clinically, how do you differentiate? Is it someone outwardly saying that they desire relationships, and so you know they're avoidant? Like,
Yeah. Fantasy is a defense mechanism, which means that it's subconscious. So the person's not going to verbalize it, right? Verbalizing it, talking about it is a product of the cortex that's conscious awareness. Fantasy is a subconscious ego defense mechanism. So fantasy will usually manifest through behavior that the patient, the person, may not necessarily have insight to because it is subconscious. Okay. On the other hand, individuals with the avoidant personality will have pretty much can have the same exact, hypothetically, history with regard to being socially isolated, but due to their being conflicted, I want to put myself out there, but I can't. They're likely to self-refer, and they're likely to present a clinical practice with anxiety and depression. Right, so I think that's where we start. We should talk about this because avoidant personality does operate with the idea that if I don't put myself out there, I can't get hurt. That's my goal, right, is not to be rejected. And it works. They don't put themselves out there. So guess what happens? They don't get rejected. Again, work through what type of learning is that. Number one, will the isolating behavior continue or weaken? Continue. So it has to be reinforcement. Does it continue because something is added or something is removed? Removed. Negative reinforcement results in the perpetuation of the avoidant personality behavior. All right. Now, we do know, a little bit of a tangent, that avoidant personality is one of 4 personality disorders that can improve with age. By the way, the other 3, antisocial, borderline, and dependent personality disorders. But avoidant is one. And that's because despite not wanting to put themselves out there, at some point they have to. Right? You're not going to graduate medical school unless you come to these lectures. Right? You're not going to get a clerkship grade unless you work with us. So over time, you're putting yourself out there whether you like it or not, whether you want to or not. And most of the percentage of that time, you'll go home and realize, you know what? The world didn't end. So all of a sudden, your thoughts, right, your cognitions of, if I don't put myself out there, I won't get hurt, get challenged. And when they get challenged and you actually do put yourself out there and you don't get hurt, well, that challenge results in a change in behavior over time. Right? Hence, why avoidant personality does tend to improve with age. Right? Final thoughts? All right, we'll end it here, and we'll see everybody back at 12:30. Thank you.